For Elara Vance, the end of the road was the cold floor of a one-room schoolhouse. The banker's eviction notice, a death sentence in her hand. Winter's chill promised a fate far crueler than poverty. Just as despair began its final work, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Jedediah Stone, the richest rancher in the territory, a man his eyes held the sorrow of a widower and the burden of raising 2 sons alone. He didn't offer pity. He offered a bargain. "You need a home, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I need a wife. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories." The wind was a predator, a relentless wolf clawing at the thin walls of the one-room schoolhouse. It found every crack, every warped plank, and poured the unforgiving cold of the plains into the empty space where children's laughter used to be. For Elara Vance, that cold had settled deep in her bones, a permanent chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The eviction notice in her hand was no longer paper and ink. It was a final judgment, a tombstone for a life that had barely begun. The last ember in the pot-belly stove had died hours ago, and with it, the final flicker of her hope. She traced the letters of her name on the splintered floorboards, the only thing in this world she still owned. This was it, the end of the road, a slow, quiet surrender to the elements. Then, a shadow fell across the floor, so vast and sudden it seemed to swallow what little light remained. In the doorway stood Jedediah Stone. He was a man carved from the territory itself, hard, weathered, and unyielding. His wealth was a legend, but the grief he wore was a raw, visible thing, etched into the lines around his eyes. He carried the silence of a widower and the heavy burden of 2 sons who were growing up without a mother's touch. He did not offer condolences for her plight or a hand of charity. His gaze swept over the barren room, assessing her desperation with a frankness that was almost cruel. He was not a savior offering pity. He was a businessman looking to fill a vacancy. The air thickened with unspoken truths, his profound loss, her absolute ruin. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a transaction laid bare on the frozen earth between them. "You need a home, Miss Vance," he said, the words stripped of all sentiment. "And I need a wife." The proposal hung in the frigid air, a shocking, brutal piece of logic. There was no pretense of affection, no promise of a future beyond survival. He was offering her a roof, a fire, a life free from the gnawing fear of starvation. In return, she would give him her name, her freedom, and her heart, or what was left of it, to the care of his motherless boys. It was a choice between a cage of gilded sorrow and a grave of unmarked snow. She looked at his unreadable face, then at the damning notice in her hand. A life for a life, a shelter for a soul. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, the word was a whisper, a ghost of a sound, yet it sealed the bargain with the finality of a nail in a coffin. The wagon ride from the schoolhouse to the stone wrench was a journey into a vast and lonely kingdom. The world seemed to shrink and then expand, the sparse town giving way to an endless expanse of snow-dusted plains under a steel-gray sky. The ranch house appeared first as a dark speck on the horizon, slowly growing into a formidable 2-story structure that dominated the landscape. It was a fortress built of dark timber and river stone, a testament to a man's will imposed upon the wild. As Elara stepped down from the wagon, the silence was the first thing she noticed. It was a profound, unnatural quiet, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound. There were no shouts of ranch hands, no clang of a blacksmith's hammer, no joyful noise of a family living within its walls. The house was immense, perfect, and as cold as the landscape it surveyed. Inside, the chill was not of the air, but of the soul. Polished wood floors reflected the muted light from tall, clean windows, but offered no warmth. A grand stone fireplace stood cold and black, a hollow mouth in the heart of the home. It was a monument to wealth, a meticulously maintained museum of a life that had ceased to be lived. And then she saw them. 2 boys, standing at the top of the grand staircase like small, were his statues. The older one, Thomas, had his father's dark hair and a jaw set with a man's defiance. His eyes, however, held a specific, chilling resentment aimed directly at her. He saw not a person, but an invader, a usurper come to occupy a throne that was not hers. He was the guardian of a ghost, and she was the trespasser, Beside him, the younger boy, Caleb, was his brother's opposite. He was small and pale, half hidden behind the ornate banister, his gaze a mixture of fear and a deep, soul-bearing curiosity. He looked at her as if she were a strange creature blown in by the storm, something to be studied from a safe distance. Jedediah made no formal introduction. He simply gestured toward the stairs, a silent command for her to follow her room, and then retreated into the shadows of his study, the click of the closing door echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness. The contract was sealed not with a vow, but with that sound. This was a place of duty, a house of unspoken rules and guarded hearts. The emotional frost that coated every surface was not from the winter outside. It was a direct reflection of the frozen, desolate landscape of Jedediah Stone's own heart. Her first act of defiance was to build a fire, not in the small stove of her assigned room, but in the great stone hearth in the main hall, a cavernous mouth that had been cold for what felt like an eternity. The strike of the match was a gunshot in the mausoleum, the crackle of catching kindling a forbidden hymn. It was a small rebellion, a single woman's attempt to push back against the crushing weight of a silence that had ruled these halls for far too long. The flames cast dancing, warm shadows on the walls, breathing a temporary life into the stagnant air. Thomas watched her from the landing of the stairs, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes condemned her for the warmth, for the light, for daring to disturb the sacred dust of their grief. He saw the fire not as a comfort, but as an act of erasure. In the following days, Elara moved through the house like a ghost herself, learning its secrets in the quiet moments when she was alone. Her duties led her to forgotten corners, to rooms that were clean but unlived in. In the back of a linen closet, her hand brushed against something soft, a woolen scarf, still holding the faint, spectral scent of lavender. Later, while dusting a grand piano whose keys were sealed shut with a layer of grime, she found a worn piece of sheet music left on the stand. The title was faded, something about a winter sonata. The corners of the pages were soft and curled, evidence of being turned by loving hands again and again. These were not cherished mementos. They were not displayed in a place of honor. They were relics, fragments of a life abandoned mid-sentence, left where they fell like evidence at the scene of a crime. There was no shrine to Sarah Stone. There were only these painful, untouched remnants that Jedediah and his sons navigated around, their eyes refusing to see. The silence of the house was not empty. It was full of a question. It screamed from the scentless scarf, from the silent music, from the cold glare in a young boy's eyes. This wasn't just a house of sorrow. It was a house of secrets. And as Elara stood in the flickering firelight, the real weight of her bargain began to settle upon her. She hadn't just agreed to be a wife and a mother. She had stepped into the heart of an unsolved mystery, and the ghost of Sarah Stone was a far more powerful presence than any living woman. The fire was Elara's only ally in the great, silent house, a crackling, breathing thing she fed and tended to with a devotion that bordered on religious. For weeks, it was a solitary comfort in a world of cold shoulders and colder glares. Then, one evening, as the shadows grew long and the wind moaned its lonely song, a new sound joined the crackle of the logs. It was a soft, hesitant shuffling from the darkness of the hall. Caleb appeared at the edge of the firelight, a small ghost in his nightshirt, clutching a worn primer to his chest as if it were a shield. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his large eyes fixed on her, the book held out in a silent plea. Thomas had forbidden him from speaking to her, a cruel decree the boy had obeyed with fearful diligence. But the frustration of the tangled letters on the page had become a greater tyrant than his brother's anger. Alaric simply patted the floor beside her. He came, sitting just outside the true circle of warmth, and opened the book. The words were a thicket of thorns for him, each one a struggle that ended in a frustrated whisper. She didn't rush him. She didn't correct. Her finger, slim and pale in the firelight, gently traced the shape of a letter. "That one makes the sound," she murmured, her voice a low counterpoint to the fire's hiss, like a quick breath. They sat like that for an hour, the world shrinking to the space of a single page. From the deep, unlit void of his study doorway, Jedediah Stone watched. He had seen Caleb throw this very book across the room, had seen the boy's shoulders shake with silent sobs of failure. He himself had tried to teach him, but his own impatience, a tool so useful in building an empire, had been a poison in this delicate task. Now, he watched this stranger, this woman of the bargain, succeed where he had failed utterly. He saw not a seductress or a usurper, but a teacher. He watched the tension leave his son's small shoulders, saw the boy lean, almost imperceptibly, into her sphere of quiet strength. A single word, horse, finally came out clear and true, and the look of astonished triumph on Caleb's face was a light brighter than the fire itself. Jedediah's face remained a mask of granite, unmoving. But something inside him, a tightly locked door deep in his chest, creaked open just a fraction. It was not warmth. It was not affection. It was a reluctant, grudging acknowledgement of the light she had brought into a suffocating darkness. He gave no sign. He made no sound. He simply stepped back, melting into the blackness from whence he came, leaving the woman and his son to their small, miraculous victory. The first trip into town was a necessary evil, a journey from the private cold of the ranch into the public frost of societal judgment. The moment Elara stepped down from the wagon onto the muddy thoroughfare of Clearwater, she felt the shift. Conversations on the boardwalk didn't stop. They changed, dipping into hushed, venomous whispers that followed her like a shadow. Eyes that had once offered a polite teacher's greeting now held a new expression, a mixture of pity, contempt, and a sharp, hungry curiosity. She was no longer Miss Vance, a respectable woman down on her luck. She was Mrs. Stone, the opportunist, the pauper who had cleverly ensnared the territory's richest and most vulnerable widower. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and unspoken accusations. Every woman who turned from a barrel of flour, every man who paused his perusal of tobacco tins, looked at her as if they could see the cold calculation of her bargain stamped on her forehead. She kept her chin high, her list clutched in her hand like a shield, her face a carefully constructed mask of serene purpose. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. The store owner, a stout woman named Martha whose face was a roadmap of the town's history, measured out the sugar and flour with a heavy, deliberate slowness. Her silence was louder than the gossip. She had known Sarah. It was in the way her eyes avoided Elara's, in the stiff set of her shoulders. As Elara counted out the coins, the woman's voice finally broke the tension. Low and sharp, not meant for the whole store, but aimed with the precision of a thrown knife. "Jedediah Stone always gets what he wants," she said, her gaze fixed on the countertop. She paused, letting the first blow land. "Pity the man never knows what he has until it's gone." The words were not just an insult to Elara, they were a eulogy for Sarah and an indictment of Jedediah. They struck Elara with a force that had nothing to do with her own shame. It was a stone tossed into the still, dark bond of the Stone family's past, and the ripples spread instantly, hinting at a tragedy far deeper than a simple, sorrowful death. The ride back to the ranch was a journey into a new kind of silence, one now filled with the echo of that woman's cryptic pronouncement. She was a wife bought for shelter, but she was beginning to understand she had also purchased a share in a history she knew nothing about, a history of a man who took what he wanted, and a woman who had been lost along the way. The storm did not arrive, it descended. A great white beast that fell from the sky, swallowing the world whole in a roaring, blinding fury. One moment, the horizon was a hard, gray line. The next, there was no horizon at all, only a churning chaos of wind and snow that plowed at the windows and screamed down the chimney. The Stone Ranch became an island, a ship locked in a frozen sea, and its inhabitants became prisoners. The vast house, a kingdom of silence, began to shrink with each passing hour, its long hallways turning into narrow, suffocating quarters. The forced proximity was a constant, low-grade torture. Every creak of the floorboards was an accusation. Every shared glance across the dinner table was a battle of wills fought in the space of a heartbeat. Jedediah retreated further into his own internal winter, a brooding, silent mountain of a man. Caleb grew skin-urged, a mouse caught between traps. And Thomas simmered. The fire Elara kept blazing in the hearth became the focal point of his rage, a symbol of her unwelcome warmth in his mother's curled home. The breaking point came on the third day. Elara was humming softly, a forgotten tune, as she mended a tear in one of Caleb's small shirts by the fire. It was a simple, domestic act, an act of motherhood. For Thomas, It was the final transgression. He rose from his chair, his movement so abrupt it sent a cascade of sparks up the flue. "Stop that," he hissed, the words laced with the venom of a cornered animal. Elara Vance went still. "Stop pretending," he snarled, his voice cracking with a boy's pain but edged with a man's cruelty. "You're just the help. A hired hand my father bought to cook and clean. You will never be her." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. The word mother hung between them, a ghost he had summoned to condemn her. The confrontation was stark, brutal, and public. Caleb shrank into himself, his face pale with terror. Jedediah, standing in the shadows of the hall, did nothing. He stood as still as a statue, his silence a tacit endorsement of his son's cruelty. The silence that fell in the wake of the boy's words was a physical thing, a shard of ice in the room's heart. It was a silence heavier than snow, deeper than any grave, and it proved that the most dangerous storm wasn't the one raging outside the walls, but the one that had just broken within them. The silence that followed Thomas's outburst was a weapon in its own right, a shard of ice pressing against every throat. Elara sat frozen, the needle still poised in her hand, the boy's words echoing in the vast, hollow space where a heart should be. Thomas himself stood panting, his chest heaving with the aftermath of his venom, a child playing with the terrible weight of a man's cruelty. The blizzard outside seemed to pause, its howl a mere whisper compared to the roaring void inside the room. For a long, unbearable moment, Jedediah Stone remained a statue in the shadows, his stillness a crushing affirmation of his son's judgment. Then, he moved. It was not the sudden, angry stride of a disciplinarian, but the slow, heavy tread of a man carrying an impossible burden. The scrape of his boot on the floorboard was a tectonic shift, drawing every eye. He walked past his son without a glance. He walked past Elara as if she were a piece of furniture. He stopped before the great stone hearth, the firelight flickering across his unreadable face, illuminating the deep ravines of exhaustion carved there. He stared into the flames, not as a man seeking warmth, but as a man looking into a memory. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a rumble of authority, but a dry husk, filled with the dust of 1,000 unspoken memories. "Your mother loved the fire." The 7 words landed with the force of a physical blow, a quiet bombshell that shattered the foundations of their fragile standoff. It was not a defense of Elara. It was not a scolding for Thomas. It was a confession. With that one sentence, Jedediah died himself, admitting that he had let the cold creep in and snuff out the very thing his wife had cherished. It was an indictment of the cold, sacred shrine Thomas had built in his mother's name, revealing it as a prison of his own making. For Elara, it was a dizzying shift in the landscape. He had not sided with her, but he had finally acknowledged the war she was fighting against the chill. He had, for the first time, aligned himself with her purpose. It was the weary admission of a failed king, a quiet plea for help to a woman he had bought, but now, perhaps, truly saw, to escape the suffocating weight of Jedediah's confession, a truth that now hung in the air between them all. Elara sought refuge in the one part of the house that felt entirely neutral, a small, forgotten sitting room on the west wing. A sheet covered the furniture, and a fine layer of dust coated every surface, dancing in the single shaft of pale light cutting through the grime on the window. She needed a simple, thoughtless task, a physical act to quiet the storm in her mind. Cleaning. She pulled the sheet from a delicate writing desk, the movement sending a cloud of ghosts into the air. As she wiped down the dark, cold wood, her fingers brushed against a drawer that refused to open. It was stuck, not locked. A gentle, persistent pressure, a slight lift, and it gave way with a soft groan of protest, releasing the faint, dry scent of old paper and forgotten time. Inside, nestled in the dark, was a small bundle of letters, tied with a silk ribbon that had faded from sky blue to the color of a winter storm. The top envelope was addressed in a graceful, looping script, "To my dearest Jedediah." They were unsent. A wave of guilt and shame washed over her. This was a sacred space, a tomb of private thoughts she had no right to disturb. Yet, the whispers of the house, the coldness in Thomas's eyes, the profound weariness in Jedediah's voice, they all demanded an answer. She felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled upon the heart of a curse and knew she must understand it to survive. With trembling hands, she untied the ribbon. She would read only one. It was a promise to the ghost whose space she now occupied. The letter she chose was not filled with rage or accusation. It was worse. It was a portrait of a soul-crushing loneliness so complete it felt like a physical chill emanating from the page. Sarah wrote of a beautiful cage, of walls built by a love that expressed itself in acres and timber but never in touch or time. He has given me a kingdom, the letter read, but I am its sole, captive subject. He looks at me with pride, the way a man looks at a prized mare or a field of healthy wheat. He provides. He protects. But he does not see. The words painted a picture of Jedediah's ambition as a third person in their marriage, a silent rival she could never defeat. The mystery of her death, the town's whispers of a tragic accident, dissolved into a terrible, clear truth on that flimsy page. It was no accident. The final lines were a desperate prayer. The silence of this house has become a living thing. I fear it will soon consume me whole. Tonight, I will ride. I will ride until the wind is the only voice I can hear. It was an escape, a frantic, reckless flight on her fastest horse, not toward a destination, but away from a silence she could no longer endure. And in that moment, Elara understood everything. The ghost haunting this house wasn't Sarah. It was the crushing quiet that had killed her. The letter was a lead weight in the pocket of her dress, a secret that pulsed with a cold, dead energy. Elara felt its presence as she moved through the now silent house, the storm outside having finally exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world draped in an eerie, pristine quiet. She held a terrible power in her hands, the power to shatter the fragile truce that had settled over them, to wield Sarah's pain as a weapon and bring Jedediah Stone to his knees. The temptation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She could expose him, vindicate the ghost in the walls, and perhaps, in doing so, carve out a place of authority for herself in this house of sorrow. But as she stood in the shadows, watching him by the fire, she saw not a tyrant or a monster. She saw the man from Sarah's letter, a man so blinded by the building of his kingdom that he never saw its queen was dying of loneliness. His guilt wasn't a secret he was hiding. It was the very air he breathed, the foundation upon which he had built his stony prison. To show him the letter would be an act of cruelty, a confirmation of a failure he was already living every single day. It would only reinforce the walls around his heart. She had to find a different key. She stepped out of the shadows, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floorboards. Jedediah didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the hypnotic dance of the flames, lost in a past she could now see with devastating clarity. He likely expected another demand, another accusation, another tremor in the unstable ground of their arrangement. She stopped beside his chair, close enough to feel the heat from the hearth on her skin. She did not speak of what she had found. She did not speak of the loneliness, the desperation, the final, reckless ride. She let the silence stretch, allowing him to feel her presence, to wonder at her purpose. Then, with a voice that was quiet but carried the unshakable weight of her decision, she asked a question that was not a weapon, but an invitation. A plea for a memory, not a confession of a crime. "Tell me something she loved, Jedediah," she said, her voice a soft thread in the stillness. Something that made her smile. The question bypassed years of hardened grief and pride. It wasn't about her death. It wasn't about his failure. It was about Sarah's life, her joy, a part of the story he had buried so deep he had perhaps forgotten it himself. His shoulders, which had been set like a bulwark against the world, tensed for a moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, they fell. He didn't answer, but a flicker in his eyes, a tremor in his jaw, told her that the key had turned. The lock had begun to give way. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire, a lonely heartbeat in the vast, still room. Jedediah's hands, resting on the arms of his chair, tightened until the knuckles were white mountains on a barren landscape. Elara's question was not a key, it was a crowbar, prying open a door he had sealed shut with years of hardened pride and silent, suffocating guilt. He did not look at her. He couldn't. His gaze remained fixed on the flames, but his eyes were seeing a different time, a different light. A ghost flickered at the edge of his vision. Sarah, her hair the color of spun gold, standing in a field of spring wildflowers, laughing as she held up a fistful of bluebonnets. The memory was so sharp, so painfully vivid, It stole the air from his lungs. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a ragged, broken thing, the sound of stone grinding against stone. Wildflowers, he whispered, the word an artifact from a buried world. She loved the wildflowers in the spring. The dam did not just crack, it disintegrated. The confession came not in a flood, but in agonizing fragments, each piece a shard of a man's shattered soul. He spoke of his ambition as if it were a fever, a relentless drive to carve an empire from the unforgiving land, to build a fortress of wealth that would protect his family from the world's cruelties. He had measured his love in acres, in head of cattle, in the height and breadth of the house he built for her. He had given her everything he owned, everything he had built. He just hadn't given her himself. I was building this, he said, his hand making a weak, sweeping gesture that encompassed the room, the ranch, the entire cold, silent kingdom. I was so busy building this for her. I never saw that she was starving inside of it. The words tumbled out now, raw and unvarnished. He confessed his blindness, his arrogant assumption that a full larder could ever replace a shared life, that security could be a substitute for connection. He admitted he had mistaken her silence not for loneliness, but for contentment. And then, the final, terrible truth. He spoke of her last ride, not as a tragic accident, but as the desperate escape it was. She wasn't running from anything, he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. She was running from the quiet. From me. The confession hung in the air, a raw, gaping wound. Years of stoic control, of unyielding strength, were stripped away, leaving only the devastating clarity of his failure. The great Jedediah Stone was, in the end, just a man who had built a perfect cage and had been left with nothing but the ghost of the bird he had forgotten to love. From the shadows of the hallway, where he had hidden to escape the storm's fury, Thomas had heard it all. He had witnessed the impossible, the collapse of the mountain that was his father. Jedediah Stone, a man of unbendable will and granite silence, had broken. And in the rubble of that collapse, the boy saw a truth that rearranged his entire world. He had spent months guarding a memory, defending a cold and silent shrine to his mother, believing it was an act of loyalty. Now, he understood it had been an act of repetition. He had been tending the very same poison that had driven her to a desperate, final ride. Elara, the intruder, the usurper. She wasn't trying to erase his mother. She was trying to build a fire in a tomb. The next morning, the world was reborn in white. The confession had been a storm of its own, and the dawn that followed was clean, quiet, and blindingly new. When Thomas came downstairs, Elara was at the stove, the rich, warm scent of coffee filling the kitchen. The air between them was no longer a battlefield. It was a fragile, uncertain space. He watched her for a moment, seeing not an enemy, but the woman who had faced down his father's ghost and, instead of running, had asked it to speak. She had healed a wound he never even knew his father carried. She turned, a steaming mug in her hand, and offered it to him. Her expression held no triumph, no pity. It was a simple, open offering. He hesitated, the old resentment warring with the new, wrong understanding. Then, his hand reached out and took the cup. His voice was a low, hoarse whisper, a sound barely audible above the hiss of the stove. "Thank you." The two words were a treaty, an apology, and a concession all at once. It was the first stitch in the slow, painstaking process of knitting a family back together. Other small gestures followed in the coming days. A shared look across the dinner table that wasn't hostile. Caleb reading openly beside the fire, his brother no longer casting a disapproving shadow. Jedediah watching them, the mask of command replaced by a weary, penitent watchfulness. The change was most profound in the house itself. The great, oppressive silence was gone. The quiet remained, a deep, foundational quiet born of the vast plains outside, but its character had transformed. It was no longer the sound of withheld words and buried grief. It was the sound of peace, of a space being made for new things to grow. It was the quiet of a home. The great white silence of winter had finally broken. It retreated first in trickles, then in streams, the sound of melting snow, a gentle, persistent music that woke the valley from its long slumber. The sun, a stranger for so many months, returned with a soft, forgiving warmth, coaxing tentative green shoots from the dark, rich earth. Life was returning to the plains. Jedediah stood on the porch, watching the transformation not just of the land, but of the small figures in the meadow below his house. Elara was there, her dark dress a stark contrast to the burgeoning green, and on either side of her were his sons. They were not the sullen, weary ghosts of winter. They were boys, alive and curious, kneeling in the damp soil. He saw Thomas point to a patch of color, his voice carrying on the breeze, not with anger, but with a question. He saw Caleb reach out a small, careful finger to touch a delicate blue petal. He walked toward them,
his footsteps slow and deliberate, no longer the heavy tread of a king surveying his property, but the quiet approach of a man hoping to be invited in. Elara was teaching them the names of the wildflowers, the very ones he had confessed his wife had loved. She was not erasing Sarah's memory, she was tending to it, allowing it to bloom again in the hearts of her sons. The cold rancher who had made a desperate bargain in a derelict schoolhouse was gone, melted away with the snow. In his place stood a humbler man,
his pride stripped away by a painful truth, his heart tilled and ready for a new season. He stopped before her, the sunlight warm on his face. The boys fell quiet, watching. "The first bargain was for my sons," he said, his voice sincere, holding none of the transactional coldness of their first meeting. He looked from Thomas's steady gaze to Caleb's open, trusting face, and then his eyes came to rest on Elara, the architect of this impossible peace. "This one is for me." The words hung in the clean spring air, a promise instead of a proposition. It was not an offer of shelter in exchange for service. It was an offering of a man's broken but healing heart, a plea for a shared life, not just a shared roof. The contract of survival, signed in the depths of winter's despair, was hereby rendered void, replaced by a new pact, offered in the full, hopeful light of spring. They help us tell more stories from the quiet frontier. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. You'll be the first to know when the next chapter arrives.